In 1990, a 17-year-old girl vanished without a trace from a quiet coastal town in Maine. No goodbye, no evidence, no explanation. Her family searched for 22 years. Then one morning, her father found a torn yearbook page, and what he discovered next would expose a secret buried deeper than anyone imagined. A secret that would bring a killer to his knees, shake an entire community, and prove that a father's love never gives up even when the world already has. This is the haunting true story of the girl who vanished in Willow Creek. The morning mist drifted in from the Atlantic like a soft, solemn veil swallowing the sleepy streets of Willow Creek, Maine, in its hushed embrace. It was the kind of fog that blurred edges, softened colors, and made the world feel as if it were holding its breath. Inside the Holloway residence, a modest colonial house tucked between cedar trees at the end of a gravel road, David Holloway stood motionless in the doorway of a room he hadn't dared enter in over 2 decades. Emily's room. 22 years ago, she had vanished without a trace. One day she was his daughter, a recent high school graduate with salt-kissed hair, bound for the University of Maine to study marine biology, and the next, she was a name on a flyer stapled to telephone poles. Missing. No witnesses, no body, no goodbye. David stepped over the threshold, the floorboards groaning under his weight, as if even the house hesitated to welcome him back into the past. Everything was exactly as it had been that spring morning in 1990, when life still made sense. Her neatly made bed still held the faded quilt his wife Margaret had sewn by hand. On the desk, textbooks were stacked beside a closed journal. Shelves lined with sea glass and seashells Emily had collected on walks along the beach shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her scent lingered faintly, a ghost of lavender and old paper. It wasn't just a bedroom, it was a time capsule, untouched, unyielding, sacred. David walked over to the window and opened it. The hinges resisted protesting after years of stillness. Fresh air rushed in, displacing the dust and memory like a sudden gust in a stagnant dream. He sneezed, then laughed bitterly, surprised by the sound of his own voice breaking the silence. "It's time," he whispered, echoing the words he and Margaret had exchanged the night before, over tea that had gone cold between long pauses. After years of holding on to hope, they had made the quiet, painful decision to begin letting go. Not of Emily, not truly, but of the things. The things that tethered them to a version of her that would never return. Today they would begin sorting her belongings. Donate what could help others. Box the rest for the attic. David moved slowly, reverently, as if touching these objects would awaken something long buried. From her closet, he pulled out a blue sweater, the one she had worn on rainy days, oversized with sleeves that swallowed her hands. A pale yellow dress she wore to junior prom, still smelling faintly of the jasmine perfume Margaret had given her. A pair of jeans with patches she had sewn herself, clumsy stitches that made David smile through the ache. He separated them carefully, one box for donation, one for storage, one for keepsakes. And then tucked between 2 binders on the bottom shelf, he found a book he had never noticed before. It was thick, its cover, glossy, its spine embossed with gold foil. Willow Creek High School Yearbook Class of 1990. He froze. The weight of it in his hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than photos and quotes, it carried ghosts. David realized with a twinge of guilt that he had never once opened this book since Emily disappeared. Back then, neither he nor Margaret could bear to see her smile, frozen in time, surrounded by faces that had all gone on with their lives while theirs had stopped. Slowly, David sat on the edge of Emily's bed and opened the book. The pages whispered as they turned, revealing snapshots of laughter, youth, and dreams. When he found her portrait, he stopped breathing. There she was, Emily Holloway, smiling with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the future was hers. Her eyes sparkled, framed by sunlight and possibility. And beneath her name, in her own handwriting, were words David had never seen before. "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me. To my teachers for making me reach higher. And to Lena, my forever friend, don't forget to return my copy of The Secret Garden Illustrated Edition, you old grandma. Love you forever." David blinked. The words weren't extraordinary. In fact, they were playful, affectionate, utterly typical of Emily and Lena's friendship. And yet they hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The Secret Garden. That had been Emily's favorite book growing up. She had collected multiple editions, hardcovers, paperbacks, even a pop-up one with pressed violets on the cover. David remembered reading it to her when she was 5, her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the drawings of the ivy-covered gate. But in all the years since she disappeared, he couldn't recall ever seeing that specific edition mentioned in her note. Where was it? Had Lena ever returned it? David's hands trembled slightly as he closed the yearbook and held it against his chest. The question itself seemed absurd. Who cared about a book after all this time? But in his heart, he knew it wasn't about the book. It was about the thread. The thread Emily had unknowingly left behind, thin, delicate, almost invisible, but strong enough to pull him forward out of the fog of grief and into something else. Something closer to truth. David stood up. Somewhere out there, Lena Brooks still existed. He hadn't seen her in years. After Emily vanished, she had come by often at first, crying, bringing flowers, sitting in silence, but eventually, like most people, she had drifted away. Maybe it had been too painful. Maybe she had her own ghost to carry. But now that one line in a forgotten yearbook had cracked open a sealed door, David didn't know exactly what he was looking for, answers, closure, or maybe just connection. But he knew one thing. He had to find Lena. He had to ask about the secret garden, not because of the book itself, but because his daughter's handwriting still lived in those pages, because some part of Emily was still calling out asking to be found. And for the first time in 22 years, David Holloway felt the stirrings of something dangerous, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long, long time. Hope. The next morning arrived veiled in overcast stillness, the kind that made everything trees, houses. People appear subdued as if nature itself were bracing for something unspoken. David Holloway sat at the kitchen table, the yearbook open beside his untouched coffee. He had barely slept. The words return. My book circled endlessly in his mind like a forgotten tune that refused to fade. Margaret moved around the kitchen in silence, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She already knew. And yet, when she saw the yearbook lying open again, she stopped mid-motion, her hand frozen above a stack of folded dish towels. David, she said, her voice flat, low, tired. We said we'd move forward. This is part of moving forward, he replied without looking at her. There's something about that book, something Emily wanted us to remember. It was a joke she said too quickly. A silly line to her best friend. It's not a clue. It's not anything. He turned to her then. But what if it is? Margaret looked at him, eyes hollowed by too many years of sadness. What if it isn't, she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he gently closed the yearbook, tucked it under his arm, and reached for his jacket. I'll be back by noon, he said, knowing full well he wouldn't. Margaret didn't stop him. She only said, she lives near the edge of the woods now, in that old RV park behind the post office, if she's still there. The RV park in question wasn't far, but it felt like traveling back through time. The road narrowed into a gravel path lined with tall pines that whispered in the breeze like they held secrets of their own. The sign at the entrance, Willow Pines RV Community, was crooked, its paint chipping. There were a dozen or so campers parked along the tree line, varying in size and condition. Some looked abandoned, others had potted plants and hanging lanterns that spoke of life and permanence. David pulled over and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin, despite the layers he wore. He approached a man with a beard who was sweeping pine needles from around his camper's steps. "Excuse me," David said. "I'm looking for Lena Brooks." The man didn't pause in his sweeping. Blue and white camper at the far end. Keeps to herself. David nodded his thanks and walked past the rows of mobile homes until he found the one in question. It was modest but well kept, with a ceramic wind chime dangling from the awning and a small planter box filled with purple petunias that were beginning to wilt. He hesitated at the steps, then knocked gently. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. She was older now, of course. The last time he had seen her, Lena had been a 17-year-old with oversized sweaters and streaks of pink in her hair. Now she stood before him in faded jeans and a thermal shirt, her hair pulled back loosely. Strands of gray woven through the blonde. Her eyes widened when she recognized him. "Mr. Holloway," she said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Wow. Please come in." She stepped aside without hesitation, opening the door wider. David climbed the steps and entered the small space. The camper was cozy, cluttered in a lived-in way, with books stacked against the wall and a teapot steaming gently on the stove. A cat stretched lazily on a window perch, uninterested in the visitor. Coffee, Lena offered. Please. She poured 2 mugs in silence, then handed him one and sat down across from him at the small built-in table. It's been a long time, she said. Too long, he agreed. I didn't expect to ever see you again, not like this. She glanced down at her coffee. Me neither. He reached into his coat and laid the yearbook on the table, opening it to Emily's page. Lena's breath caught the moment her eyes landed on the handwriting. I'd forgotten about that, she said, tracing the words with her finger. God, she called me Grandma for everything. David watched her carefully. She mentioned a book, The Secret Garden. Do you remember it? Lena's expression shifted into something complicated tenderness, layered with guilt. She stood without answering and moved to a cabinet under her bed. A moment later, she returned holding a worn illustrated copy of The Secret Garden. The corners were frayed, the dust jacket long gone, but the cover was unmistakable. I never returned it, she said. I meant to. After she disappeared, I couldn't let it go. It was the last thing I had from her. She handed it to him. He accepted it reverently as if it were made of glass. Opening the book, he flipped through the pages, inhaling its scent. Something fluttered out from between the pages. A torn sheet from a fashion magazine. A young man mid-laugh posed in trendy clothes against a brick wall. There was something familiar about him. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, a gaze too practiced for his age. Do you know who this is? David asked. Lena leaned over to look. That's Cameron Blake. He was in our class. David stiffened. The boy who modeled, yeah. He had a few gigs back then. I think he's still in fashion now. Has his own brand or something. Why did Emily... Did she ever talk about him? Lena hesitated, her mouth twitching with uncertainty. Not really. I mean, there was a time junior year when she said he seemed interesting. She thought maybe he was misunderstood. But we'd both agreed he was kind of a creep. Always staring, always trying to impress people. He had that charm, you know. The dangerous kind. David frowned. Emily never mentioned him to us. She might have kept it quiet. She had a soft heart, wanted to believe everyone had good in them, even when they didn't deserve it. Lena looked away, her jaw tightening. She asked me once to drive by his house, said she just wanted to see where he lived. I thought it was weird, but she was so insistent. I didn't ask questions. I wish I had. Did you ever tell the police about that? Yeah. Back then when they questioned all of us. I mentioned him, but they said he had no record. Brandon, her boyfriend at the time, was the main focus. Poor guy. The whole town turned on him. David stared down at the book in his hands. Why would she use Cameron's face as a bookmark? It wasn't because she liked him, Lena said. In fact, I remember now. She hated him. Said he gave her chills. She tore that page out of my magazine and said, perfect. He can be my bookmark. Nothing better for him. That made David pause. Emily, emotional and intuitive as she was, didn't often express disdain so bluntly. For her to call someone chilling, that meant something. Do you know where Cameron lives now? He asked. Lena pulled out her phone and scrolled through a few messages. Our high school class had a reunion last weekend. I didn't go, but they posted pictures. It was at Cameron's house, actually. I think he hosted. Here, this is the address. She handed him the screen. A quick glance was all he needed. Would you mind sending it to me? Of course, she said, already forwarding it. David, do you think he's involved? He looked up at her, the corners of his mouth drawn tight. I don't know, but I plan to find out. Lena stood as he did, reaching for his arm. Please. Tell Margaret I said hello, and thank you for letting me keep the book all these years. It's all I had left of her. David nodded, the yearbook now tucked firmly under his arm, again the bookmark still inside. As he stepped out of the camper into the late morning fog, he felt the wind lift slightly, brushing against his cheek like the touch of a memory. There were still too many unanswered questions, but at least now he knew where to ask them. David Holloway sat in his car at the edge of Willow Creek's business district, watching the GPS as it calculated the route to a neighborhood he'd never had reason to visit until now. Ravenwood Heights, a place of manicured lawns, slate driveways, and homes, with names instead of numbers. It was a world apart from the modest clapboard house where he and Margaret had raised Emily, where laughter used to echo off the walls and smell of sea salt wafted through open windows in the summer. Ravenwood Heights felt like another planet, and someone from his daughter's past had made it his home. Cameron Blake. The name rolled through David's mind like a stone down a hill, gaining speed, gaining weight. He had looked him up that morning, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The headlines were all the same: Cameron Blake, fashion's enigmatic innovator. From small-town dreamer to style icon. There were photos, interviews, magazine covers. The boy who once grinned from a torn-out page in Emily's old book had become a man who wore confidence like a tailored suit. But in every picture, David saw something else beneath the surface. Something cold, something rehearsed, something hollow. The GPS beeped. Turn right onto Bellhurst Lane. He followed the voice. Cameron's house was hard to miss, a modern stone and glass structure with a circular drive and ornamental maple trees out front. The landscaping was meticulous, the kind of care that came with money, or the need to control everything. David parked discreetly across the street, his fingers drumming the steering wheel. The yearbook sat on the passenger seat beside him, its corners worn, the bookmark still peeking out like a tongue. He watched the house, unsure what he hoped to see. After several minutes, the front door opened. A man stepped out with a young woman, elegant mid-30s, dressed in soft pastels. She laughed at something he said, then leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. David recognized him instantly. Cameron Blake, still tall, still handsome in a sharp-edged way. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his features sharper now, age into distinction. But it was his eyes, those same eyes from the magazine photo, that unsettled David most. Not because they had changed, but because they hadn't. Calculating, guarded, always watching. Cameron walked the woman to her car, waved, and turned to go back inside. As he did, his gaze swept across the street and locked on David. For a beat, they stared at each other. David cursed himself for not parking further away. The car's windows weren't tinted. He was exposed. Cameron's posture shifted instantly, alert, tense. David knew it was now or never. He shut off the engine, grabbed the yearbook, and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. As he approached the open gate, Cameron stood motionless on the steps, his arms folded across his chest. "Good afternoon, David," called out, trying to sound casual. "Cameron Blake, isn't it?" Cameron didn't smile. His tone was clipped. "Who are you, and why are you watching my house?" "I'm not here to cause trouble," David said, stopping at a respectful distance. "My name is David Holloway. I'm Emily's father." For a second, Cameron's expression didn't change. Then something flickered: recognition, discomfort. Something else too quick to name. "Emily Holloway," he repeated as if tasting the name. "She was in my graduating class. She went missing 22 years ago." Cameron nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember that." David held up the yearbook. "I found this yesterday. It led me to Lena Brooks. She mentioned you." Cameron's eyes narrowed. Lena didn't even come to the reunion. "I'm not here to rehash high school drama," David said, his voice level. "I'm trying to understand my daughter's last days. I heard you may have been close to her at one point." Cameron snorted. "That's a stretch. I barely knew her. We had a few classes together, maybe spoke once or twice. That's it." David tilted his head. "That's not what Lena remembers." "Then Lena's remembering wrong," Cameron said sharply. "Look, I told the police everything back then. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I've moved on. Maybe you should too." David took a step closer, his grip tightening on the yearbook. "Why are you so defensive?" "Because," Cameron said, voice rising slightly, "people like you come out of nowhere with sad eyes and accusations wrapped in politeness, hoping I'll confess something I didn't do. I'm not that stupid." David held his ground. "I never said you did anything. I said I want answers, even a conversation, something to help us finally understand what happened to Emily." Cameron's jaw worked. "You're wasting your time." "You were in photos with her," David said, raising the yearbook. "You talked to her. Maybe more. Maybe you meant something to her. Doesn't that warrant a few minutes of honesty?" Cameron exhaled hard. "She was nice, but she wasn't my type. And we weren't friends. Whatever Lena told you, it's exaggerated." David was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You know she used your photo as a bookmark in the secret garden." That landed. Cameron blinked, clearly thrown. "What?" "She used your photo," David repeated. "But Lena said she hated you. So why would she keep that picture in her most cherished book?" Cameron hesitated, then shrugged too quickly. "Kids are weird. Maybe it was a joke." David didn't move. "You said you barely spoke to her, but you hosted a reunion at your house last week. You knew she was gone, that her case was never closed. Did it not occur to you that someone might ask questions?" Cameron's face hardened. "I don't owe you anything. Now I suggest you leave." Without waiting for a reply, he turned on his heel and walked back into the house. The door closed with a final dismissive thud. David stood alone in the driveway, staring at the door. His pulse was pounding. That had not been the reaction of a man with nothing to hide. As he returned to his car, he glanced back at the house once more. The curtains were drawn now. No sign of movement, but David felt it in his bones. Cameron Blake was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had Emily's name buried somewhere inside it. He got into his car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Part of him wanted to drive straight home, tell Margaret he'd tried, that there was nothing more to find. But the other part, the stronger part, was already forming a new plan. He didn't know yet what he'd uncover, but he wasn't done. Not even close. David Holloway didn't go home. Instead, he parked his car at a quiet overlook off the main road, staring at the steering wheel as the day dimmed into an iron-gray dusk. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "We said we'd let go." But how could he let go when everything in Cameron Blake's voice and his eyes, in the way his muscles tensed at the mere mention of Emily, screamed guilt? David looked at the address Lena had texted him the day before. The same address where he'd just had that brittle electric confrontation with a man who clearly wanted the past, buried perhaps quite literally. But it wasn't just Cameron's defensiveness that bothered him. It was the details, the photo bookmark, the torn magazine page, the lie that they barely spoke when Emily had asked Lena to drive by his house, the timing, the tone, and then the flowers, hyacinths, white, Emily's favorite. David rubbed his temples. Coincidence maybe, but why would a man who barely knew her trigger such a visceral response to a simple question? Why would that man's name show up in the last physical memento his daughter ever mentioned? His phone buzzed, a breaking news alert. He dismissed it. And then, as if by instinct, he pulled out the old yearbook again. This time, he turned to Cameron's senior profile. The boy in the photo smirked with the practiced ease of someone who had never heard the word no in his life. His bio was full of fluff-style ambition, living loud, and a vague quote about trusting your instincts. David stared at those words. Then he started the car. Back at Cameron Street, he parked further away this time, tucked between two trees lining the opposite side of the cul-de-sac. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. And just as the light began to wane into an amber haze, the front door of the Blake residence opened again. Cameron stepped out alone this time, carrying something. A wooden box tucked under one arm, a bouquet of white hyacinths in the other, and slung over his shoulder, a long-handled shovel. David's breath caught. He ducked low in his seat, watching through the rearview mirror as Cameron loaded the items into the back of a sleek black SUV. No hesitation, no confusion. Every movement deliberate routine. Cameron got behind the wheel, glanced once up and down the street, then pulled away. David counted to 10. Then he followed. They drove through Willow Creek in silence, Cameron unaware, David invisible. They passed the old lighthouse, the shuttered bait shop, the diner where Emily used to order cherry pie after school. Then the town faded behind them, replaced by trees and mist and a road that narrowed into memory. Finally, Cameron turned off onto a private gravel path, marked only by a rusted gate chained open. David drove past, parked at a distance, then got out on foot. The path led to a small cottage near the edge of Raven's Bluff, a cliffside property known more for its views than its visitors. The ocean spread out below, like a sheet of hammered silver waves crashing gently against the jagged rocks. David kept low, using the trees and brush for cover. He saw Cameron unload the SUV, the wooden box, the shovel, the flowers. And then slowly the man began to walk down a narrow path behind the cottage toward the cliffs. David followed from a distance, heart pounding in his throat. The wind picked up, carrying the salt of the Atlantic and the scent of something older, heavier, regret maybe, or warning. Through a break in the trees, David saw Cameron stop at a clearing near the cliff's edge. No markers, no benches, just earth and sea and silence. Cameron set down the box and flowers, then began to dig. It wasn't a large hole, 2 feet, maybe 3. The rocky soil resisted, but he worked steadily as if he had done this before. David crouched behind a ridge of stone, watching. After a while, Cameron knelt beside the hole. He opened the wooden box. David couldn't see what was inside, but he saw Cameron's face change, from cold to contemplative. He picked up a piece of paper, read it, then another. His lips moved silently, mouthing words no one else would ever hear. Then he stopped and simply stared at the contents frozen in time. A gust of wind swept across the bluff. Suddenly, the papers inside the box burst into the air like startled birds. Cameron cursed, grabbing at them wildly, chasing them across the clearing. David saw his chance. He crawled forward, slowly staying low. His hand reached out and caught one of the papers that had blown further than the others, half buried beneath a patch of scrub. It was a photo, black and white, a teenage girl, Emily, her eyes wide, her arms restrained. David almost screamed. He shoved the photo into his coat and scrambled back behind the rocks. Cameron didn't notice. He finished collecting the papers, returned to the box, placed the bouquet of hyacinths on top, and then delicately set the box into the hole. He filled it slowly, patting down the earth, then pouring water over the mound from a jug he'd brought. Then he stood and spoke aloud. "I think you can hold these memories now, Emily." David felt the air leave his lungs. He jerked backward, his foot slipping on loose stone. He caught himself against a tree, but the sound too loud echoed across the bluff. Cameron's head snapped up. "Hello," he called, voice sharp. David froze. "Is someone there?" Cameron grabbed the shovel and took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the trees. David didn't breathe. After a moment, Cameron muttered, "Just the wind," but his tone was unsure. He circled the perimeter of the clearing, eyes scanning the shadows. David pressed himself deeper into the earth. After what felt like an eternity, Cameron turned back, gathered his things, and walked toward the cottage. David waited and waited. Then, when the trees fell still and the sound of the waves returned to dominance, he crept forward. To the mound. To the disturbed soil. To the spot where Cameron had buried the truth. He had no choice now. He had to know. He had to see. David Holloway's fingers wrapped around the wooden handle of the shovel Cameron had left, leaning against the cottage wall. It was still warm from use, the wood slick with lingering sweat. The sun had begun its slow descent into the Atlantic, casting the bluff in a golden haze, but David saw none of it. His vision tunneled toward the patch of freshly disturbed earth that now stood like a silent accusation against the sea. With each step he took toward the mound, the ocean roared louder, as if trying to drown out the sound of memory breaking free. He knelt, feeling the dampness of the soil seeping into the knees of his pants, and plunged the shovel into the ground. The blade bit through the loose soil easily. Shovel after shovel of dirt was tossed aside, revealing the top of the bouquet, hyacinths still fragrant, now bruised. He set them aside gently, almost reverently, as if disturbing them too roughly might wake something deeper. When the tip of the shovel struck wood, he froze. His heartbeat thundered against his ribs. Hands trembling, he clawed away the remaining soil with his fingers until the box was fully exposed. Its lid was sealed but not locked. He reached for it, heart pounding in his throat, when a voice behind him shattered the silence. "I knew someone was out here." David spun around, dirt-streaked and breathless, to find Cameron standing a few yards away, his silhouette backlit by the last blaze of sunlight. The expression on his face was a horrifying blend of fury and grim satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come back," Cameron said, stepping closer. "I saw your car parked up the hill. I knew you were watching." David's grip on the shovel tightened instinctively. "You said her name," he growled. "You buried something with her name. You lied to me, to the police. What have you buried here? Cameron, what does Emily have to do with this? You don't know what you're talking about." Cameron snapped, advancing a few steps. "This doesn't concern you anymore. She was my daughter." David hissed, standing. "She still is, and I will not let you hide whatever this is. You need to leave." Cameron said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now. Not until I see what's inside that box." I said. Cameron pulled a pistol from his jacket, raising it with a shaking hand. "Drop the shovel." David didn't flinch. "Go ahead," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Shoot me. But know this, I already called the police. My location's been pinged. You shoot me, they'll find you before you can disappear again." Cameron's eyes flickered, uncertain, and in that second of hesitation, David moved. He kicked at Cameron's hand, sending the gun skidding across the bluff and dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The two men lunged at once, David diving for the phone in his pocket, Cameron for the gun. The phone hit the ground, bouncing toward the cliff. David scrambled after it, his knees scraping the rock, fingers clawing at gravel, until they closed around the phone, just inches from disaster. Behind him, Cameron cursed, then roared in fury as he lunged with the shovel, swinging it wildly. David ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and jammed his thumb against the SOS button. A faint vibration told him the signal had gone out. Sirens would come. They had to. "Stop this," Cameron David shouted. "Just tell the truth. It's too late to hide anymore." "You don't understand," Cameron screamed, his face contorted. "I have a life, a company, a reputation. You want to ruin all that because of something that happened decades ago. Because you killed her," David yelled, voice breaking. "Didn't you? You loved her or wanted her. And when she said no, she should have stayed away." Cameron bellowed. "She kept coming back. She looked at me like I could be saved, like I was some broken thing she could fix. She wouldn't leave me alone. She was a child," David shouted. "She was 17. She betrayed me." Cameron screamed, and in a sudden blur of motion he charged, slamming into David and knocking him to the ground. The two men rolled dangerously close to the cliff's edge, fists flying, knees scraping stone. Cameron's hands found David's throat. He squeezed, snarling through clenched teeth. "You should have just let her go." David clawed at Cameron's arms, vision-dimming lungs begging for air. Spots danced in his eyes, then in the distant sirens. Faint but growing louder. Cameron hesitated. David gasped for air. "Please," he croaked. "Don't make this worse." Flashlights appeared through the trees. Shouts, uniforms, "Freeze someone," bellowed. Cameron's grip loosened just as a squad of officers broke into the clearing, guns drawn, voices booming. "Step back with your hands where we can see them." Cameron dropped the shovel. David collapsed against the dirt, coughing violently. Officers swarmed. Cameron was wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, read his rights. One officer helped David to his feet, guiding him to a nearby rock where he sat trembling. "Are you hurt, sir?" "Just out of breath," David rasped. The box he pointed. He buried something. He said Emily's name, "My daughter. She went missing 22 years ago." The officer's face darkened. "Sanders, I remember that case. Stay here. We'll get the detective." A forensic team arrived minutes later. The bluff lit up with lanterns and camera flashes. David watched numbly as gloved hands dug out the wooden box, opened it. Photographs, notes, printouts. A child's handmade doll. The smell of lavender and dust. Detective Carmen Hill, now the lead on the case, crouched beside David. "We're going to go through everything. We'll treat it with care, I promise." David nodded, but his eyes were on the mound of earth behind her. "That's not all. There's more out here. Bones. Something's buried near here. Deeper." The detective's face paled. She stood and gave the order. Search patterns were expanded. Dogs brought in. And less than an hour later, one of the cadaver dogs froze, then pawed at the ground 15 feet away. "We found something a technician called." David didn't need to see. He already knew. Emily. 22 years of wondering, of begging the universe for answers, of waking at night with her name on his tongue, it was ending here. The ground was finally giving her back. And as the officers uncovered the fragile soil-stained remains of his daughter, David Holloway sat motionless beneath the stars, hands filthy throat, raw heart shattered open. But in that moment, even through the tears and horror and grief, one thought rose above the rest. He had found her. He had kept his promise. Emily would not be forgotten. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, had finally come to light. The forensic floodlights turned Raven's Bluff into an island of sterile brightness against the darkened coastline, illuminating every stone, every crack, every terrible piece of truth long buried beneath years of silence. David Holloway stood wrapped in a thermal blanket beside Detective Carmen Hill, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the coastal wind. The forensic team had just retrieved the wooden box Cameron Blake buried, and now, with gloved hands and clinical precision, they began to examine its contents. Each item pulled from that dirt-streaked interior peeled away another layer of denial. First came the photographs, some innocent at a glance, just Emily smiling at school, scribbling in her notebook, leaning against a tree, but others David couldn't bear to see. One photo in particular made him turn away, his stomach lurching violently. It showed Emily barely older than 17, seated on what looked like a wooden chair in a cabin. Her wrists weren't visible, but her posture, the stiffness in her shoulders, the panic in her wide, glassy eyes. It told the whole story. "She's restrained," whispered one of the forensic techs. "See the shadow line here across her arm rope." Detective Hill nodded grimly and carefully turned the photo over. Scrawled in large, erratic handwriting on the back were the words, "You must still love me. You must still love me. "You must still love me," written over and over as if whoever had written them needed to convince not her, but himself. Jesus Christ! Carmen breathed, her jaw tightening. Another image followed Emily near the cliffs, her smile, stiff eyes hollow. And then a third, her face twisted in clear fear. On the back of that one was a rambling note: I tried. But she lied. She said we'd run away together, but she never meant it. She was going to tell. They would find her. They would take everything from me. I couldn't let that happen. She's still mine. Even now. Always. He documented everything, Carmen muttered, flipping through more papers. He kept these like trophies. Among the collection were printed text messages, slightly yellowed some, with the ink smeared or fading. One series began playfully with Emily teasing about class music, her cat. Then it shifted into more intimate tones, into Emily trying to understand him, as she wrote, "I think you've just been hurt too much. You build walls because you're scared. But people can change, Cam. I believe that." Cameron's replies were shorter, vague, possessive, repetitive. "Don't talk to Brandon again. I need to know where you are. I can't sleep if you don't answer. If you leave, you'll ruin me." The final message from Emily, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, was chilling in its finality. "I can't do this anymore. I tried. You need help, and I can't be the one to give it to you. Please don't contact me again." She tried to end it, David whispered, voice dry as sandpaper. She knew it was dangerous. She tried to protect herself, Carmen said softly, her eyes still scanning the papers. But she also tried to save him. That's who she was. Then came the object that broke David, a small handmade doll about 6 inches tall, crafted from yarn and bits of fabric. It had been stitched clumsily, but with care. Its face was drawn on with permanent marker, its hair made of dark thread. David recognized it immediately. Emily had made it in a summer art class when she was 13. He remembered the night she brought it home, proudly holding it up at dinner like a trophy. "It's my protector," she'd said. "She's small but strong, like me." She had named it Fern. Now, decades later, Fern had been buried with photos of her fear and the words of a man who had taken everything from her. David's knees buckled and he sank onto the grass beside the detective. Carmen knelt beside him silently, her presence not as an investigator in that moment, but as a witness, someone who had seen darkness before and still never got used to it. "Why would he bury it all now?" David asked. "Why bring it here 22 years later?" Carmen looked toward the ocean, where the tide had begun to rise again, gentle but persistent. "Some people bury evidence, others bury guilt. This looks like both. A twisted kind of ritual, like he was trying to control how she was remembered, or make peace with himself before it all caught up to him. And if I hadn't come here, he'd have gotten away with it," Carmen said flatly. Again. Behind them, voices rose. A separate team had unearthed human remains 15 feet from the initial burial site. Bones, partial clothing, and the unmistakable glint of a bracelet silver with a tiny dolphin charm. David pressed a fist against his mouth to stifle the sob that rose in his throat. Emily had loved dolphins, wanted to swim with them, wanted to protect them, wanted a world where even the most misunderstood creature could be saved. "We'll confirm it with dental records and DNA," Carmen said gently. "But I think we both know what we've found." David nodded numbly. He was barely aware of the other officers, of the bagging of evidence, the snapping of photographs. All he could see was Emily, his bright, stubborn, brilliant girl, reduced to fragments in the earth, betrayed by someone she believed she could fix. Later, under the cold fluorescent lights of the Willow Creek Police Department, Carmen took David aside. "We've arrested Cameron Blake," she said. "He's refusing to speak without a lawyer, but the contents of that box are damning. We'll get a confession. It's only a matter of time." "I don't care about confessions," David said hoarsely. "I care about her being remembered, not as a case number, not as someone who made a mistake, but as who she really was." Carmen nodded. "We'll make sure of that, I promise." That night, alone in the guest room of a cousin's house where he'd agreed to stay, David sat at a small desk and opened the yearbook one last time. Emily's photo smiled back at him, frozen in youth, framed by a future she never got to live. He traced the lines of her handwriting, the joke about the secret garden, and thought of the fragile, stubborn belief she carried that people could change, that love was a cure, that she was strong enough to rescue someone from the dark. And maybe in a way she had, not him, but herself. Her words had remained, her truth had surfaced, and her father, worn, grieving, relentless, had never stopped searching. Not even when the world told him to give up. She was found. She was heard. And now, finally, she would be free. The sun rose pale and slow over Willow Creek, filtering through a haze of sea fog and salt-washed air. Down at Raven's Bluff, where the soil still bore the scars of the night before, a silence had settled that was almost reverent. The forensics team had left their equipment packed, the site flagged and sealed. Only one thing remained, what they could not take away. The feeling, the weight, the knowing. David Holloway stood near the edge of the clearing, the same spot where Cameron had tried to bury the past. The wind tugged at his coat. His hands, lined with age and calloused by a life of holding on, were clenched into fists at his sides, but not from anger, from restraint, from grief trying to stay in place. Behind him, tires crunched on gravel. A familiar engine idled to a stop. He turned just as Margaret stepped out of the car. She looked smaller, somehow, not older, but more fragile, as if the very architecture of her being had cracked quietly under the weight of 22 years of waiting. Her eyes met his, and in them was everything: relief, heartbreak, apology, endurance. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. She crossed the distance between them and slipped her arm through his. Together, they turned to face the mound where their daughter's remains had been found, now covered with a white tarp and circled with evidence markers like a crown of thorns. Moments later, a second car arrived. The door opened and Lena Brooks emerged, clutching something tightly to her chest. The old book, The Secret Garden. Its cover was worn, its pages bloated from years of air and moisture, but it was intact, sacred. She didn't look at David or Margaret at first. She just walked to the edge of the site and stared. Her lips trembled. Then she dropped to her knees. "Why didn't you tell me, Em?" she whispered, not to anyone living. "Why didn't you say it was him?" David took a step closer. "She tried, Lena," he said gently, in her own way. She thought she could fix him. She always thought she could fix the broken things. Lena shook her head. "We used to laugh at girls like that, girls who fell for boys like him. We swore we'd never be them." Her voice cracked. "I should have seen it. I should have." No, Margaret interrupted, stepping forward. Her voice was low but firm. "Don't you do that. Don't you carry this as if it was yours to prevent. He was the monster. He made the choice. You loved her. That's what mattered, and she knew it." The three of them stood there in the wind, bound by loss, bound by the echoes of a girl who should have grown into a woman with a life of her own. Instead, she had become a symbol, a caution, a wound that shaped the very way they breathed. "She's coming home," David said quietly, more to himself than anyone. We waited so long to say that out loud. Carmen Hill arrived minutes later with a small procession of officials, Detective Langston in tow, returning from retirement out of quiet solidarity. A black van pulled up last, its rear doors marked with the seal of the county medical examiner. Margaret turned away when the stretcher came out, her fingers digging into David's coat sleeve, not from fear, but from the need to anchor herself to something human while watching the unimaginable happen in front of her eyes. Emily's remains, what was left of her, were carried out gently draped in white. No spectacle, no drama, just reverence. As if the world finally understood who it had lost. "She was brilliant," Margaret whispered as the body bag was lowered. "She wanted to swim with whales, write papers, discover species no one had seen before. She would have made this world better." "She still did," David replied. "She made us better, even now." Lena stepped forward, the book still in her hands. She bent slightly, resting it on the earth before the stretcher. "I'm sorry I never returned it," she murmured, "but I never stopped reading it, and I never stopped talking to you." Detective Hill joined them, speaking softly. "Once the lab finishes with the remains, you'll be able to move her. We'll help with arrangements, whatever you need. A private service, if that's what you want." David nodded. "We're not putting her in the ground." Carmen raised an eyebrow. "No, she loved the ocean," Margaret said, finding her voice again. "Always said she belonged to the sea. That's where she's going. Not a grave, not stone, water, open, free." Carmen's expression softened. "Then we'll make it happen." As the van pulled away, the Holloways and Lena remained at the bluff. No one rushed them. No one disturbed them. They stayed while the sun climbed higher, while the shadows shortened, while the town below continued with its quiet routines, morning deliveries, clinking coffee cups, dogs barking in yards. Life moved on. But up here on the cliff, where time had once been frozen in silence and secrets a chapter had closed, not with rage, not even with revenge, but with return, with the profound, unspeakable power of truth, unearthed of memory, reclaimed. Emily Holloway had been lost for 22 years, but now, finally, she was coming home. The water was calm that day, unnaturally calm for the Atlantic coast of Maine. The sky above Willow Creek was a washed-out silver, blanketed by high clouds that diffused the light into something soft and reverent. The tide whispered gently against the docks as the flotilla began to form. Boats, some modest, others aged from decades of sea air, began to circle just off the shoreline, tethered not by ropes, but by grief, memory, and reverence. In the lead boat, David and Margaret Holloway sat side by side, the urn cradled between them like something sacred. They had chosen it together, a simple white vessel, smooth and unadorned, save for a tiny engraving near the base, always the ocean. Lena sat at the bow, the copy of The Secret Garden wrapped in a ribbon of sea blue silk in her lap. She had read from it aloud earlier that morning, alone in her camper, trying to find the right words to carry across the water. Now her voice was silent, but her hands trembled slightly, gripping the worn book like an anchor in a sea of mourning. Behind them in the other boats were faces familiar and forgotten. Emily's former classmates, her high school principal teachers, who had once told her she was destined for something big. Even Detective Carmen Hill and retired Detective Langston were there, their eyes scanning the water like guardians of closure. The minister stood at the center of the deck, wind tugging at his robes, voice calm and measured. Today, he said, we commit Emily Holloway not to the ground, but to the sea she loved. She once dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, of diving into the deep and understanding what the world beneath the surface had to teach us. She never got that chance. But today we give her back to what she loved most. Today we let her swim again. David stepped forward. His face was drawn with sleeplessness, but his voice held firm. Emily, he said, cradling the urn, you were the light in every room. You laughed with your whole body, you forgave too easily, and you believed in people who didn't always deserve it. You believed in the good of things, of oceans, of animals, of people, even when it cost you. He swallowed hard, pausing to steady himself. For 22 years, we woke up every day not knowing. But now we know. And knowing is terrible. But it's also peace. It's the start of healing. It's the start of remembering you as you really were, not missing, not hidden, but bright. Bright and whole and brave. Margaret stepped beside him, taking one of his hands, resting her other on the urn. Go, baby, she whispered, eyes shining. Go be the current, the reef, the breath of the sea. Together they tilted the urn. A delicate stream of ash floated into the wind. It caught the air and spiraled upward, then drifted slowly down to meet the water where it scattered like mist on the waves. At that same moment, from every boat, white hyacinths were tossed into the sea. Petal after petal joined the ocean's surface, a floating garden of remembrance, delicate and wide blooming, for a girl who once thought she could save everyone but herself. Lena stepped forward last. She held the book in her hands, kissed the cover, once then laid it gently on the water's surface. It floated for a moment, the ribbon trailing behind it like a ribbon of sorrow, then slowly sank beneath the waves. Goodbye, Em, she said, her voice cracking. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't ask the right questions, but I never stopped looking for you, and I never will. Carmen Hill moved to the bow hands in her coat pockets. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once, a gesture of deep respect. Detective Langston stood beside her. We failed her back then, he said quietly, but maybe we helped her now. Carmen didn't answer. Some things weren't meant to be answered. As the boats began their slow journey back to shore, the white blossoms trailed behind them like a constellation of loss. No music played, no words were spoken, just the sound of water, the rhythm of waves, and the deep aching quiet of goodbye. That evening, back at their home, David and Margaret sat on their porch with a framed photo between them, not the posed senior portrait, but a candid shot taken years before. Emily on the beach, hair windblown, eyes squinting from laughter, holding up a starfish she'd found in a tide pool. The world was still mystery then, still promise, still full of tomorrows. I think we can start living again, Margaret said softly, not forgetting, just breathing. David nodded. She was like you, he said, kind, stubborn, full of hope. And she had your heart, Margaret replied, touching his hand. The kind that won't let go until the truth comes home. They sat in silence then as the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the sea whispered stories only the lost could hear. Somewhere out there, Emily was free, not in a casket, not in a file, not in a rumor or a newspaper clipping, but in the water, in the flowers, in the hush between waves, and finally in peace. The interrogation room at the Willow Creek County Police Department was designed to be neutral. The walls were pale gray, the lighting flat, the furniture simple and cold. It was the kind of space where no emotion could hide and no lie could comfortably live for long. Cameron Blake sat at the metal table in a tailored jacket now dirt-stained and wrinkled, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him. His once groomed hair clung to his forehead with damp sweat, and the confident smirk he wore in magazines and press interviews was gone. What replaced it was not regret, not shame, but exhaustion, a man unraveling from the inside. Detective Carmen Hill stood across from him, arms folded, the file in her hand, thick with evidence. She had been watching him for 2 hours, watching the slow shift from resistance to weariness, from arrogance to inevitability. "Cameron," she said, voice low measured, "you hosted a high school reunion at your house a week ago. You knew people would be talking. You knew some would ask about Emily Holloway. You planned this, didn't you? You buried that box at Raven's Bluff before someone else could find it in your house." Cameron stared at the floor, silent. Carmen opened the folder. She pulled out a photo, the one of Emily in the cabin. Then another, her face in terror. Then the doll, then the messages. She didn't slam them down or demand he look. She simply placed them gently on the table like puzzle pieces, waiting for the hand that would finally admit where they belonged. "Why keep these?" she asked. "Why save them? If you were innocent, if she meant nothing, why hold on to every word she wrote you for 22 years? Cameron's mouth twitched. He leaned back, the chair creaking. "Because," he finally said, voice hoarse, "she was the only one who ever saw me. Saw you how, not the magazine version, not the interviews, not the next big thing. She saw me, and she didn't flinch." Carmen leaned forward. "She also told you no." Cameron's eyes flicked up, dark, stormy. "Yes. Eventually." "And you couldn't take that?" "You don't understand," he snapped, anger surfacing like an old bruise. "She wasn't just some girl. She listened to me, believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And then one day she was just done, like none of it mattered. Because she realized you were manipulating her," Carmen replied coolly. "Because she was 17, Cameron, and you were dangerous." He looked away. "She started dating Brandon, publicly, like I was never even part of her story." "Because you weren't," Carmen said. "Not the way you imagined. That wasn't love. That was control." Silence. Carmen opened a second folder, printouts from Lena Brooks, her statement, and Emily's final message. She slid them across the table. "She told you it was over. You couldn't accept that. So what did you do?" Cameron swallowed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then, like something cracking from the inside, he exhaled and said, "I waited for her." Carmen said nothing. "Just waited. I followed her after school." He continued slowly, carefully. "She had this routine. Bike ride by the marsh, stop at the coffee shop, then home. But that day she went to the cliffs instead. I think she needed air. Or escape. I don't know. But I was already there." His hands clenched. "I asked her to talk. She said she didn't want to. I begged. I told her I needed closure. She agreed to come with me to the cabin, just for 10 minutes. Carmen's jaw tightened. "She trusted you. She pitied me," he corrected. "But she still came. Then what I kept her there," he whispered, "just for the night. I thought, if she remembered everything, the talks, the notes, the way we used to connect, she'd change her mind. She didn't. She got scared." "Did she try to leave?" She screamed, hit me, tried to run. His voice cracked now for the first time. I panicked. I grabbed her arm too hard. She fell, hit her head, but she wasn't unconscious, just stunned. "So you stopped helping her," Carmen said, "and started hiding." He nodded slowly. "I tied her hands, just for a while, just until I could think. And when she still said no," Cameron's eyes glistened, but with fury, not tears. "She said she'd tell people, said I needed help, said I made her feel unsafe." "You did," Carmen snapped. You made her feel terrified. And then what? You hit her again, strangled her. Cameron shook his head. No, she ran, made it to the cliff's edge. She turned back to yell something, and He stopped, clenched his jaw. I don't know, I charged. It wasn't planned, it just happened. She fell. You pushed her. No, I grabbed her. We both fell. I caught myself. She didn't. Carmen's eyes narrowed, and instead of calling for help, you buried her. I buried her, he confirmed, barely audible, and kept everything else. Because I couldn't let her go. Not even then. Carmen stared at him as if trying to memorize the face of delusion. You kept her doll, she said, her messages, her fear, and you buried it all like a shrine. It was all I had, he whispered. And now, you have nothing, she replied, except the rest of your life to remember what you did. As she turned and left the room, David waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall, hands shaking. Carmen didn't need to speak. Her eyes told him everything. He confessed, David asked. She nodded, said he wanted to be remembered by her. But now he'll be remembered by everyone for what he really was. David closed his eyes. The walls felt like they were closing in, but not with panic, with release. The truth now spoken aloud had lost its power to hide. And though the pain would never fully leave him, neither would the feeling that, at long last, the silence had been broken. Emily's voice had been restored through memory, through evidence, and through the father who never stopped listening for it, even when the world gave up. The courthouse in Willow Creek hadn't seen this much activity in years. The marble steps, usually silent except for traffic fines and civil disputes, now bore the weight of reporters, cameras, victims, and ghosts. Every morning, the same crowd returned local residents who remembered Emily Holloway as the shy girl in the front row of biology class, the one who volunteered at the tide pool exhibit and wrote essays about saving coral reefs, the girl who once lived at the edges of the town's attention, and then vanished from its conscience for over 2 decades. But now she was back, not in body, not in voice, but in testimony, in evidence, in headlines. And in the silent, thunderous stares that followed Cameron Blake as he was escorted into the courtroom each day in handcuffs. He looked smaller now, still well-dressed, still composed on the outside, but without the shine of confidence. He avoided eye contact, with the jury, with the public, with the woman seated in the second row, clutching an old photograph of her daughter, Margaret Holloway, Emily's mother, whose face carried more strength than rage. She didn't blink when Cameron entered. She didn't flinch when the prosecutors read out the list of charges. She just held the photo like it was a shield. David sat beside her, not with clenched fists or simmering hatred, but with the unyielding stillness of someone who had already walked through hell and come out the other side with one purpose left, to speak his daughter's name into every silence that tried to swallow it. The prosecutor's voice was calm, but sharp, slicing through the courtroom as she presented the first piece of evidence, the handwritten messages between Cameron and Emily. On a projection screen behind her, each word appeared in black and white. I think you're better than they say. I can't fix you. I've tried. Please don't follow me again. Then the messages turned. If you tell, I'll disappear you. You'll regret walking away. The jury shifted in their seats. The weight of the words filled the room like rising water. Next came the photos, only a select few. The judge had ruled most inadmissible for public view, too graphic, too traumatic. But what remained was damning enough. Emily terrified, Emily vulnerable, Emily frozen in time. David looked away for the first time that day, not out of fear, but because no father should have to see his daughter's final moments reduced to still frames and forensic evidence. Lena testified next. Her hands trembled, but her voice never cracked. She spoke of Emily's light, her belief in broken people, her softness, her certainty that even a person like Cameron could change if someone just loved him hard enough. She didn't understand that love isn't medicine, Lena said. It's not a cure. It can't fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed. She paused, looking at Cameron, who sat motionless, eyes cast downward. She was 17, Lena continued. She thought she was strong enough to save him, but she shouldn't have had to. A murmur ran through the courtroom. One juror wiped their eye. Another looked away. Then came Carmen Hill, taking the stand with precision and quiet fury. She walked the court through the timeline, Emily's disappearance, the years of silence, the discovery of the box, the confession, and finally, the unearthing of Emily's remains. She was buried, Carmen said plainly. Not just in the ground, but in memory. Her case went cold because he didn't look like a suspect, because we all wanted to believe he was just a kid who grew up to do well. But underneath it all, he never let her go. Not in his mind, not in his twisted version of love. The defense tried to reframe it, said it was manslaughter, an accident, a relationship that spiraled. They said Cameron was young, confused, mentally unwell. They called his actions tragic, but not monstrous. But the evidence screamed otherwise. And when David was called to testify, the courtroom fell to a silence so complete it might have shattered. He walked slowly to the stand carrying Emily's yearbook under one arm. He placed it beside him and looked directly at the jurors. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I'm not here because I want him to suffer. I'm here because my daughter can't speak for herself. Because for 22 years, she was treated like a ghost, something people whispered about, but never really looked for." He opened the yearbook to her page, pointed to the handwriting, the one line that started it all. "Don't forget to return my book." She was alive when she wrote that, smiling, hopeful, full of plans. And this man? He nodded toward Cameron, took all of that. Not just from her, from my wife, from her friends, from the world that never got to know what she might have become. He paused, swallowing down the emotion clawing at his throat. The world failed her once. Please don't let it fail her again. When he stepped down, no one moved, not even Cameron. The trial lasted 9 days. The deliberation took 6 hours. And when the verdict was read guilty on all counts, there was no applause, no outburst. Just a heavy exhale that rolled through the room like a wave. Cameron Blake was sentenced to life without parole. He didn't speak, not once, not to the court, not to the Holloways, not even to the press as he was escorted out in chains. But it didn't matter. His silence, once a weapon, now meant nothing. The truth had been spoken by others, loudly, clearly, irrevocably. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered, not in celebration, but in penance. Old classmates embraced Margaret. A former teacher handed David a letter Emily had once written for a scholarship found tucked inside a drawer. The mayor offered to name a new tide pool exhibit after her at the Marine Center. She never left, someone said. We just forgot to keep looking. David stood beneath the oak tree near the courthouse steps, the breeze tugging at his coat, and watched as a group of teenagers walked by holding white hyacinths. He didn't cry, not because he wasn't broken, but because something in him had finally, after years of searching, doubting, and aching, come to rest. The trial was over, but Emily's story had only just begun to be told. The tide was low the morning the memorial began. A soft fog clung to the streets of Willow Creek like an apology, and the sea just beyond the harbor whispered with gentler waves than usual, as if the ocean itself had paused to listen. Down by the Marine Education Center beneath the bluff that once concealed a crime construction tape fluttered in the breeze. But there were no police lines, no search dogs this time, only volunteers, teenagers with paint on their clothes, mothers with watering cans, elderly neighbors with bent backs pulling weeds from what would become a living memorial, a garden, not of stone and sorrow, but of color, resilience, and story. Margaret Holloway knelt in the soil with her sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the earth. She was no longer fragile, no longer silent. She pressed each hyacinth bulb into the dirt, with care spacing them, precisely watering them with quiet reverence. Each flower was white, pure, hopeful, each one a piece of Emily. Behind her, a curved wooden bench had already been installed. Carved into its backrest were the words, "For Emily Holloway, who believed even broken things could bloom." David stood with Lena a few feet away, finalizing the placement of a standing plaque. On it were 3 simple lines, her name, her years, and one quote. She saw the good in what others ignored. Lena had chosen the words. They came from a line Emily once wrote in the margin of the secret garden. "It's strange," Lena murmured. "The whole town came. They're planting, they're painting. It's like they want to fix what they didn't say before." David nodded. "It's not enough, but it's something." He paused, looking out at the bluff in the distance. "You know, I used to think closure meant forgetting, or moving on, but it doesn't. It means planting something, right where the pain was." Lena looked over at Margaret, who was now helping a group of school children press hand-painted stones into the path leading to the bench. "She's strong," Lena said. "I don't know how she does it. She always was," David said quietly. Emily got it from her. That evening, the three of them returned to the garden just before sunset. The crowds had gone, the tools had been put away, but the flowers, dozens of them, now remained. Newly planted, not yet in bloom, but already speaking. David sat on the bench, his eyes reflecting the fading sky. "I had this dream last night," he said softly, not looking at anyone. Emily was sitting right here, barefoot dirt on her hands. She wasn't sad. She wasn't scared. She was humming. That old song from when she was a little girl. The one from that beach cassette we used to play. The tide pool songs. Margaret said, her voice warm. She loved that silly music. She looked at me and said, "It's okay now, Dad. You can rest." And then she just turned into light. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore, not suffocating. It felt full, like the pause before something begins. Maybe this garden, Lena said, can be that light now, for someone else. "That's the idea," David whispered. "For every girl who's afraid to speak, for every parent still waiting, for every person who thinks no one's listening. Maybe here they'll be heard." Margaret leaned into his shoulder, and they sat together, eyes on the flowers that hadn't yet bloomed, but surely would. A few yards away, Carmen Hill approached quietly. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a sweater, her badge tucked away. She carried a small stone in her hand. "May I?" she asked. David nodded. She bent and placed the stone carefully beneath the bench. It bore one word painted in shaky cursive: "Seen." Then she stood, looked at the three of them, and simply said, "She changed me." The stars came out slowly that night, one by one, over Willow Creek. Not bright, not showy, just steady. And in the quiet, as the town settled and the sea exhaled, a single white hyacinth opened its first bloom under the moonlight. Months passed, but the garden at the edge of Willow Creek never stopped growing. By early spring, the hyacinth stood tall in luminous white blooms, whispering in the breeze like voices finally set free. Children from the local school had begun calling it the Listening Garden. They didn't understand all of it, only that a girl named Emily once lived there in stories, and that now, if you sat quietly on the bench with your hand on the soil, the wind would say something soft, something you couldn't quite hear, but always somehow understood. David Holloway walked the path every morning before the sun was fully up. He didn't come with questions anymore. He came with a thermos of coffee, a folded newspaper, and the steadiness of a man no longer chasing ghosts. Some mornings, Margaret joined him, sitting with a sketchbook in her lap, drawing waves or stone or the curve of a petal. Other mornings, he came alone, tracing his fingers along the edge of the plaque, sometimes whispering updates aloud about the garden, about Lena, about how the world kept spinning even without her, and how he was finally learning to live with that. Lena moved out of the camper and into a small cottage near the town library. She volunteered twice a week at the Marine Center, teaching young girls about sea urchins and starfish using Emily's old notes and laminated field guides. She never used a microphone. She didn't need to. The kids leaned in close when she spoke, and after class, some of them would ask, who was Emily? Was she a teacher? A scientist? Lena would always answer the same way. She was someone who believed in people even when they didn't believe in themselves, and she made me want to be brave. On the 1-year anniversary of the trial, the town held a candlelight walk from the courthouse steps to the garden. No speeches, no slogans, just soft light, soft footsteps, and the names of other missing girls read aloud under the stars, names not forgotten, not buried, not dismissed. Carmen Hill led the reading. She stood by the bench where Emily's story had found its roots again and read the last name herself. Her voice didn't tremble. Emily Holloway. Found. Remembered. Free. That night after the crowd had gone, David remained. He sat on the bench, lantern flickering beside him, eyes closed. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the ache of loss like a weight. He felt it like a thread, something still attached, still moving through the world, quiet but present. "I miss you," he whispered. "But you're still here, aren't you?" A breeze picked up, then gentle, cool, smelling faintly of salt and spring, and the petals of a nearby hyacinth brushed against his hand. He smiled. "I thought so." In the end, Emily Holloway didn't become a famous scientist. She didn't publish studies or map coral reefs or dive into trenches, but she became something else, a spark in the dark, a voice that lingered long after it was silenced, a garden that bloomed where once there was only silence. And in that quiet town by the sea where the cliffs still rose and the tide still turned, her story became more than a tragedy. It became a beginning, a reminder that even when the world forgets, even when justice sleeps, love keeps digging, keeps asking, keeps finding. And sometimes, when we listen hard enough, the lost find their way back through the people who refuse to stop hearing them. Emily was found, and now she would never be forgotten. Emily's story reminds us that the truth can be silenced but not erased, that even after decades of darkness, a single voice of fathers, of friends, of towns can bring the light back. If this story moved, you share it. Let someone know they are not forgotten, because behind every missing face is a name, a life, and a love that still echoes. Leave a comment if you've ever held on to hope against all odds. Subscribe for more stories that speak for the silent. And remember, justice doesn't always come fast, but it comes when we refuse to stop asking.